It allows individuals to receive permanent residency status regardless of age. It contains no commitments to reduce illegal immigration, no commitments to strengthen our border, and it seems to allow the federal government to waive restrictions on all sorts of criminal violations. Now, you have experience in administering our immigration laws. If we enact this legislation into law, what would be the practical effect of these criminal waiver provisions, for example?
Thank you, Senator. So in terms of the criminal waiver provisions, this bill has them in the full discretion of the Secretary to make determinations as to whether those waivers are appropriate and also to whether an individual should be deemed a public safety risk. But there are many exceptions to that. The ultimate effect would be a series of very severe crimes, including crimes that are considered aggravated felonies under our immigration laws, crimes of violence and theft offenses that would carry a year sentence at least, that would not be deemed felonies, or that could potentially not be deemed felonies under this act because this act defines felonies as a year or more, whereas certain states would, with a year or more, whereas that would only require a year sentence. I'm sorry, let me repeat that because more than a year, not a year or more, but more than a year. So 366 days, not 365. And that is a huge difference there. Additionally, looking at the DACA provisions from when DACA was initially introduced, there was no felonies or significant misdemeanors. And that is not here either. So pretty much most misdemeanors can be waived, especially if they're aged. Old misdemeanors, 1 or within 5 years or 2 within 10 years, can be waived, and that does have serious consequences in terms of the types of crime that we could see people then getting this done. Now, Senator, if I may, I think I misspoke briefly when I was answering Senator Grassley's questions about the DACA eligibility versus this. I said that the DACA enrollees had to be here by June of 2012. I misspoke. It was June of 2007 they have to be here, and they have to be under 31 in 2012. So I just wanted to correct that for the record.
Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm glad that we have the opportunity today to talk about what is happening on the border and to have a chance to look at and examine what is, I think, a humanitarian crisis. It is a national security crisis. It is a drug crisis. It's also, frankly, a moral crisis. When you see what these cartels are doing on our border, when you see the children being exploited and smuggled for profit by these cartels at the border, when you see the lies that these cartels are telling innocent people to get their money and bring them across the border, and when you see the effects of the drugs that are flowing across this border into every community of my state. I come from the state of Missouri. You can't visit a community in my state that is not, frankly, awash in drugs. From where? From across the border. Our border, it is a state of total crisis, and it is a crisis that is affecting every single person in my state and in this country. And I suggest to you, we have a moral obligation, and this administration has a moral obligation to address the crisis it has created at the border for children, for families, for American citizens. And I'm glad we get to talk about this. You know, the statistics tell the story. I mean, the number of family units crossing the border is up 4,143% from last May. 4,143%. That border crossing is not safe. It is not. The border is not open, and yet the Biden administration has sent the message that it is open, and it has effectively encouraged this illegal smuggling. It has encouraged this exploitation of children. It has encouraged the drug crisis we see with its policies. That's a hard truth, but it is the truth, and the American people are owed the truth. And the moral consequences of these policies have to be confronted and addressed and owned up to. And I'm afraid I can't support the legislation we're considering today because I think it goes in exactly the opposite direction. I think creating new loopholes for illegal immigrants who have criminal records, sending the message that more people ought to come here illegally while devaluing legal immigration is exactly the wrong way to go. So, Mr. Edlow, let me just ask you about some of the details of this bill. It allows individuals to receive permanent residency status regardless of age. It contains no commitments to reduce illegal immigration, no commitments to strengthen our border, and it seems to allow the federal government to waive restrictions on all sorts of criminal violations. Now, you have experience in administering our immigration laws. If we enact this legislation into law, what would be the practical effect of these criminal waiver provisions, for example?
Thank you, Senator. So in terms of the criminal waiver provisions, this bill has them in the full discretion of the Secretary to make determinations as to whether those waivers are appropriate and also to whether an individual should be deemed a public safety risk. But there are many exceptions to that. The ultimate effect would be a series of very severe crimes, including crimes that are considered aggravated felonies under our immigration laws, crimes of violence and theft offenses that would carry a year sentence at least, that would not be deemed felonies, or that could potentially not be deemed felonies under this act because this act defines felonies as a year or more, whereas certain states would, with a year or more, whereas that would only require a year sentence. I'm sorry, let me repeat that because more than a year, not a year or more, but more than a year. So 366 days, not 365. And that is a huge difference there. Additionally, looking at the DACA provisions from when DACA was initially introduced, there was no felonies or significant misdemeanors. And that is not here either. So pretty much most misdemeanors can be waived, especially if they're aged. Old misdemeanors, 1 or within 5 years or 2 within 10 years, can be waived, and that does have serious consequences in terms of the types of crime that we could see people then getting this done. Now, Senator, if I may, I think I misspoke briefly when I was answering Senator Grassley's questions about the DACA eligibility versus this. I said that the DACA enrollees had to be here by June of 2012. I misspoke. It was June of 2007 they have to be here, and they have to be under 31 in 2012. So I just wanted to correct that for the record.
Thanks for that. Back to the criminal violations, the waiver restrictions. Am I right in thinking the bottom line here that very serious criminal offenders could find a way under this legislation to obtain lawful residency status?
Well, I absolutely think so. And even if the waiver doesn't apply to them, the waivers are broad, but even if the waiver doesn't apply to them, the definition of expungement under this act, which would allow any expungement for any reason or any vacature of any reason to be the basis to allow consideration under this bill, would create a real problem. And that's very contrary to our understanding of immigration law, to the precedent that we have in certain matters that have been decided before the Board of Immigration Appeals.
Well, thank you for that. My time has expired. I just want to say in closing that I think what today's hearing in this legislation betrays is a pretty fundamental difference of opinion between us on these sides of the aisle about what our immigration system is about and should be trying to do. And I'll just say, Mr. Chairman, from my point of view, the reason I can't support this legislation is I think the point of our immigration system should be to encourage and facilitate legal, lawful immigration, should be to protect the American people, to prioritize American workers and American families, and to secure and protect our border. And I think this does exactly the opposite. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Right now, we have a massive crisis at our southern border. My home state of Texas is bearing the brunt of this crisis. In the last month, CBP agents encountered 180,034 illegal immigrants crossing the border. That is a 674% increase from last May. That is stunning. We are on path to have over 2 million people cross the border illegally this year, the highest rate in 20 years. Where were we last year? Last year, we had the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. To my Democratic colleagues on this committee, I ask you, why haven't you gone down to the border? Joe Biden refuses to go to the border. Kamala Harris refuses to go to the border. Indeed, Kamala Harris seems to go everywhere else except our southern border. In 6 months, the Senate Judiciary Committee has not had a hearing on the crisis at the border. The approach of congressional Democrats is they don't want to know. The approach of President Biden and Vice President Harris is they don't want to know. When asked about it, Vice President Harris laughed and said, well, I haven't been to Europe either. Well, you know what? Joe Biden's in Europe right now. Maybe it's time for the person ostensibly in charge of the border from this administration to go to the border. And there's a reason Joe Biden doesn't want to go to the border. There's a reason Kamala Harris doesn't want to go to the border. There's a reason Senate Democrats on this committee don't want to go to the border. Because they know if they go to the border, the TV cameras will come with them, and they have no answer for this humanitarian crisis that is playing out. I challenge my colleagues on the committee, go look at the Biden cages. I've seen them, cage after cage after cage of little boys and little girls packed in, 1,700% capacity. COVID rate of positivity, 10%. Go look at the children that are paying the price for this failed immigration policy. And let's be clear, this crisis is the direct result of decisions made by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The very first week in office, Joe Biden immediately halted construction of the border wall. The very first week in office, Biden returned to the failed policy of catch and release. The very first week of office, Biden ripped to shreds the Remain in Mexico international agreement that had produced the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris caused this crisis, and congressional Democrats are perpetuating this crisis by hiding from it and keeping the policies that aren't working. And let's be clear, it is evident to anyone who looks at the problem what the cause is. Here's what the president of Guatemala said when Joe Biden took office, quote, "The very next day, the coyotes were here organizing groups of children to take them to the United States." That's the president of Guatemala. How about the president of Mexico? Here's what he said. He said that people see Biden, quote, as the migrant president, and so many feel that they're going to reach the United States. The message from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to the traffickers, to the cartels, is the gates are open, come on in. The message is, give us your children, and I will tell you to my colleagues, look in the eyes of the little girls and little boys that are being physically abused, that are being sexually abused. This is not compassionate. This is not humane. Children are suffering because of your policies. And what do Senate Democrats do? Don't have a hearing on the crisis. Let's have a hearing on amnesty instead. The two bills here, one would grant amnesty to 3 million people, another would grant amnesty to 4.4 million people. Mr. Edlow, what message do the traffickers here? What message do the people thinking about coming here illegally here? What message do the parents getting ready to give their small children to traffickers to come to America here when Congress's message is, we will grant amnesty if you come? What's the effect of that message?
Now is the time to come. That is the message. Come across now. You have a good chance of being able to stay here, either under the radar and wait for the next amnesty, or you may even be able to benefit from this one because the availability for documentary requirements here include, at minimum, 2 affidavits from people. It's very easy. That invites fraud. It's so easy to get 2 affidavits to say that you've been here since before January 1st of this year, even if you haven't. So now is the time to come because nothing is going to happen. The enforcement mechanism of this country in immigration enforcement has been turned off. Prosecutorial discretion is ruling the day just like it did back in the Obama era, and the result is going to be the same with flagrant disregard for the law by criminal aliens and by those that want to exploit our laws now, like the smugglers. And that's why we see things even months ago, like horrific car accidents where close to 20 migrants were found in an SUV that was overturned, and many were killed and seriously injured. And that's because of these policies. There is absolutely no enforcement along the southern border. There's absolutely no enforcement except for a small little bit of what's left from ICE in the interior of this country. And immigration courts are being told to just go ahead and terminate cases if they don't meet the stringent requirements that they're needing to for priority. Because suddenly priority is based on limited resources that seemingly just turned up overnight. I don't understand what's going on right now, because I can tell you, Senator, how it's supposed to be at the border. I can tell you how we're supposed to see people when they come over and what's supposed to happen under Section 235 of the Act. I have no idea what is going on. And I can tell you, Senator, whatever Border Patrol and ports of entries you visited, whatever Border Patrol sectors you visited, you are only seeing what's going on there. I don't know what's going on at the other ones. And I don't believe there's any consistency in the way that.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you. I have to say that we heard from Senator Coons terms that we often hear about children who are brought here through no fault of their own, who have never known another country. And that's why we need a solution like the House bill. The House bill would give a green card, though, to, say, an 18-year-old who arrived here in December. So that's very different than what Senator Coons portrayed or what the Democrats portray that this legislation would do. And that's why this hearing itself is so ill-advised. We have a crisis at the border. Illegal migrant flows that we haven't seen in a generation. The vice president gallivanted around Central America and Mexico last week looking for the root causes. I could have saved the taxpayer the travel expenses. The root causes are right up the street at 1600 Pennsylvania. It's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris running on an open borders campaign, that message being heard across the world, and hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens showing up at our border, not just from Mexico and Guatemala, but literally all across the world, to include Europe and Africa and Asia, because they know that our borders are open. And as Mr. Edlow testified earlier, the very fact that the United States Senate is having a hearing on granting a massive amnesty under these conditions will simply exacerbate this crisis. It will be used tonight by traffickers and smugglers to induce more desperate parents to send their children to our border, to encourage more people from around the world to make that very dangerous trip that will then put even more stress on our border and our law enforcement agencies, lead to more crime in this country, to lower wages and fewer jobs for the American people. So, Mr. Edlow, I'd like to ask a few more questions about this bill that my Democratic colleagues are promoting today. The so-called DREAM Act portion of this bill is falsely portrayed as being focused only on those children, as I mentioned earlier. But isn't it true that the bill allows green cards and citizenship for illegal aliens who entered the United States before January 1, 2021, as long as they were under 19?
Yes.
So in my hypothetical, an 18-year-old shows up at our border on December 31st and gets in. He is just as entitled to a green card under this legislation as some of the witnesses that we have here today and many other of the DACA program recipients who were, in fact, children when they came here and who have, in fact, lived in this country for decades. Seems to me like a very inequitable piece of legislation. Another question, Mr. Edlow. Let me give you another hypothetical. Let's suppose there's a Colombian family of three, a married couple and their 13-year-old adult son who also happens to be a gang member. They heard Joe Biden in the campaign last year. They also began to immigrate here, but they didn't quite make it by December 31st. They arrived in January. So technically, they're not eligible under this legislation. Isn't it true that all they have to do is find two other illegal aliens to attest in a document that they arrived here before January 1, and they also will be eligible for a green card?
They can certainly present that as the evidence, the documentary evidence.
In your long history of enforcing our nation immigration laws, have you ever known illegal aliens to commit fraud in an effort to stay in our country?
Absolutely. When I was in immigration court, all the time.
Shocking. I can't believe that people who have risked everything and spent their life savings to come from places, again, not just Mexico, as far afield as Romania and Bangladesh, as have been encountered on our southern border in the last few months, would also be willing to lie on a piece of paper to a federal bureaucrat so they can stay here in this country. Mr. Edlow, isn't it also the case that President Obama's DACA program, even if you include all the expansions, never had more than about 1.5 million people eligible under its terms?
As it's already been said here, we had about 650,000 who are currently enrolled in DACA, and then looking at the Migration Policy Institute, they were estimating somewhere around 1.5 to 1.8 million would have been eligible, but
Who were
that's
eligible.
an estimate. Yeah.
And this bill from the House would not make those 650 to 700,000 DACA recipients eligible alone. It wouldn't even make those 1.5 to 1.8 million DACA eligible persons covered. This bill would allow more than 4 million people to get an amnesty. Isn't that correct, Mr. Edlow?
That's correct, Senator. And I would also just quickly point out that the second part of the bill dealing with the Promise Act dealing with TPS right now under statute cannot be considered by the United States Senate. Statutory bar under INA 244H requires a supermajority of the Senate to allow any measure that would consider adjustments of status or permanent residency for temporary protective status holders to pass through that supermajority before it can even be considered or brought up on the floor of the Senate. So that part of the bill, in my opinion, can't even be brought up at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Edlow. One final point. Ms. Root, I would be remiss if I didn't express my deepest condolences and sympathy for your loss and your family's loss, and my great admiration for your courage in appearing here today and speaking out over the years for all of the thousands of American citizens who have been the victims of illegal alien crime. I'm very sorry.